The castle loomed in the distance, a jagged silhouette against the setting sun. Julian Thompson's fingers tightened around the steering wheel of his sleek black limousine as it glided along the winding path leading up to the estate. The grandeur of it all, the centuries-old stone, the ivy clinging to its facade, the spires reaching into the sky, was breathtaking. It was the perfect backdrop for the wedding he had meticulously planned. A wedding that would cement not just his union with Aurora Richardson, but his place at the apex of society. As the car approached, Julian let out a slow breath, trying to calm his nerves. Not that there was anything to be nervous about. He had everything under control. This was his show, and everyone would watch in awe. In the back seat with him, Aurora shifted in her seat, adjusting the diamond necklace around her neck. She caught Julian's eye in the rearview mirror and smiled, a smile so polished it almost looked like a photograph. It was the kind of smile that belonged to the woman who would marry Julian Thompson, heir to an empire of wealth and influence. "You're quiet," she said, her voice smooth and measured. "You're not having second thoughts, are you?" Julian's lips twitched into a smirk. "Of course not," he replied. "Just taking it all in. Everything's falling into place, exactly as planned." His eyes swept over the landscape outside the car, but in his mind, he wasn't thinking about the wedding. He was thinking about Leila Collins, his ex-girlfriend. The woman he had left behind without a second thought, convinced that his ambition would take him further than any relationship ever could. He hadn't heard from her in years, but when he decided to invite her to this wedding, it wasn't out of any lingering affection. It was a calculated decision. He wanted her to see what she had lost. He wanted to show her just how far he'd come, how right he had been to leave her behind. "Everything is perfect," Aurora said, her voice a little too sweet, as though she were reminding herself of the fact. She flipped her glossy blonde hair over her shoulder and gazed out the window, almost as if imagining herself in the spotlight, her face framed by all the opulence that Julian had orchestrated. Julian caught her reflection in the glass. She was everything he'd wanted: polished, powerful, beautiful. A woman of status, a woman who could fit into his world effortlessly. It wasn't love, not in the way he had once felt for Leila. But Aurora was the right choice. She understood him. She didn't ask for much, and most importantly, she didn't challenge him. "Are you sure Leila's going to come?" Aurora asked, her voice dipping slightly, though her smile remained unwavering. Julian chuckled, his gaze flicking toward her. "She'll come. Curiosity's a hell of a thing. Trust me, Aurora. When she sees what I've built, when she sees you, she won't be able to resist. This is everything she never had, everything she never could have. She'll regret walking away." There was a strange tightness in his chest as the words left his lips, but Julian pushed it down. He was a man who thrived on control. Control of his destiny, his career, his life. And he had spent years building this life, this perfect, shiny, unshakable facade. The limousine pulled up to the grand entrance of the castle, where the red carpet stretched out before them, leading into the ballroom where hundreds of high-profile guests awaited. Julian stepped out first, his polished shoes clicking against the cobblestones. Aurora followed, her designer gown flowing behind her like liquid silver. The grandeur of the setting was impossible to ignore. The castle was a masterpiece, every inch adorned with gold leaf, intricate tapestries, and flower arrangements so lavish they could have been plucked from a dream. Julian had spared no expense, and the atmosphere felt almost like a stage, with every guest playing their part in the performance of his life. Guests milled about in the reception hall, glasses of champagne held delicately in their hands, laughing, congratulating him, admiring the splendor of the setting. But Julian's eyes weren't on them. He was scanning the crowd, searching for a glimpse of her, Leila. It had been 7 years since they last spoke. 7 years since he'd left her behind, too focused on climbing the corporate ladder to even consider what he was sacrificing. He had never fully understood her pain, her frustration. that feeling of being cast aside, as if she were just another rung on his ladder to success. But today he would show her what she had lost. Today she would see who Julian Thompson had become, and she would regret it. He spotted her then, standing near the edge of the room. She was looking at a tray of hors d'oeuvres, her expression neutral but observant, and beside her, almost hidden behind her, was a child. A boy, no older than 5. He had dark hair and bright green eyes that immediately caught Julian's attention. His heart skipped a beat as he watched the child's movements, the way he seemed so familiar, so him. The air around Julian seemed to slow. His mind reeled. No, it can't be. But as Leela turned slightly, the boy's features became clearer, and the resemblance was undeniable. The same shape of the jaw, the same way his lips curved in thought. Aurora noticed his gaze. "Julian?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "Who is that?" But Julian couldn't tear his eyes away from the boy. There was no mistaking it. The child's features were his own. His heart pounded in his chest, a storm of confusion and guilt churning inside him. Lila had never told him. As he walked toward her, his legs feeling heavier with each step, Julian's mind raced. He had prepared for this moment, but not like this. He had imagined a smug smile, a regretful glance, maybe even a quiet, defeated apology. What he hadn't expected was this. A child. His child. When he reached her, Leela turned slowly, her eyes locking with his. She looked older, more composed than he remembered. But there was something in her gaze, a quiet sadness mixed with a hint of something darker, something he didn't recognize. "Julian," she said quietly, her voice betraying none of the turmoil that surely churned inside her. She didn't offer a greeting, a smile, or even a word of congratulations. Instead, she nodded toward the child at her side. "This is Elias," she said, her tone flat. Julian's voice caught in his throat. "Elias?" His voice cracked. He's mine." Layla's expression remained unchanged. "He's your son, Julian, and you're too late." Before he could respond, the child looked up at Julian, his face full of innocent curiosity. "Mom, who is that man?" The question hung in the air like a heavy weight. Julian's mind went blank. His heart, a moment ago beating with pride, now thudded painfully in his chest. His son. The boy's innocent gaze held more power than Julian could have ever imagined. The golden chandeliers in the ballroom reflected off the crystal glasses, casting shimmering light over the crowd. The music, a soft and elegant string quartet, seemed to pulse through the floor beneath Julian's feet, a delicate reminder that this was not just any wedding. This was his wedding, his achievement, his show. Yet the sight of Leela, standing at the edge of the room, unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. He had imagined this moment for years, the reunion, the reminder, the subtle display of his success. He had thought he would feel triumphant, smug, maybe even a little victorious. But as he looked at her now, with that little boy at her side, the feeling that gripped him was not pride. It was something darker. Guilt, regret, a sense of loss. Lila Collins, the woman he had left behind so easily all those years ago, had walked into the room like a ghost from his past. She was no longer the young, hopeful woman he had abandoned in favor of his career. The woman he had been too busy to notice when she tried to tell them that their relationship was more than just a distraction. No, she was a stranger now. Stronger, more guarded, and yet there was still something achingly familiar in her eyes. Julian's breath hitched as the boy beside her tugged at her hand, looking up at her with wide eyes full of innocence and curiosity. There was no mistaking it. The boy was his. Elias. The realization hit Julian like a slap to the face. His stomach twisted. He couldn't breathe. He had never even considered the possibility of a child. Not with Leela, and certainly not in this moment. His fingers clenched at his sides as his gaze snapped between Leela and the boy, who was now eyeing the guests with a mixture of wonder and confusion. How? How did this happen? The thought echoed in his head like a drumbeat. Had he really been so wrapped up in his own ambition that he had never once stopped to consider the consequences of leaving Layla behind? He had never known. And now, standing in front of him, was the living proof of his neglect. Julian, Aurora's voice broke through his reverie, tight with a mixture of confusion and discomfort. What's going on? Her hand rested lightly on his arm, but there was no mistaking the tension in her voice. She had noticed his strange reaction to the boy, to Leela. I need to speak with Leela, Julian said, his voice strained. He barely registered Aurora's confused glance before he turned away from her. His eyes locked on Leela, who was now conversing with a couple of guests. He couldn't take his eyes off her. Aurora's hand dropped from his arm. "What about me?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Julian, we're supposed to be—" "I'll explain later," he cut in sharply, before forcing himself to turn away from Aurora and toward Leela. Layla noticed Julian approaching long before he reached her. The air around her seemed to thicken, the buzz of voices fading into a distant hum. She turned, her gaze meeting his with a calmness that betrayed nothing. For a moment, they simply stood there, the space between them heavy with the years they had spent apart. She had come here today not to rekindle anything, not to seek his forgiveness or plead for anything. She had come for Elias, but seeing him now, seeing Julian now, brought a flood of memories she wasn't quite prepared for. The laughter they had shared, the future they had imagined, all of it had once felt so real. And now it felt like a lifetime ago. "Julian," she said, her voice even. "You're here." He swallowed hard, his voice rough when he finally spoke. "Is he mine, Leela? Tell me, is he really my son?" She didn't flinch, didn't look away. She simply nodded, her gaze unflinching, as if she were the one delivering the blow, not him. "Yes, Elias is your son. I tried to tell you, but you didn't listen." The words stung, not because they were untrue, but because they were too true. Julian's eyes flickered to Elias, who was now distracted by one of the servants offering a tray of hors d'oeuvres. The child was so familiar. He could see it now, the way Elias moved, the tilt of his head, even the glint in his green eyes. It was him. It was Julian in the form of a child. "I didn't know," Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never knew." Leela sighed, her gaze softening ever so slightly. "I know. You were too busy with your future to notice. I didn't expect you to. But I tried, Julian. I tried to tell you, over and over. You were too focused on your career. You were already gone before I even had the chance." The words hit him like 1,000 knives. But they weren't laced with malice. There was no anger in her voice, only a quiet resignation. A weight he couldn't shake. He took a step forward, his hand instinctively reaching for the boy, but then paused, the magnitude of the situation washing over him. How did you do this, Leela?" "Alone." His voice cracked, and it made him feel small, fragile, a man who had been so sure of himself only moments ago. "I didn't have a choice," she replied, her gaze steady. "You walked away. I had to make my own way." She shifted slightly, her eyes flickering over to Elias, who was now speaking to one of the elderly guests with an innocent enthusiasm. "I built a life for him. A good one. A life without you in it." There it was again, that weight in her voice, the quiet dignity that had formed from years of doing it all on her own. Julian's chest tightened. He wanted to say something, apologize, explain. But he didn't know how to fix this. He had no idea where to even begin. Before he could say anything else, Elias turned to him, his face bright and curious. "Mom, who's that man?" he asked again, the question pulling Julian out of his thoughts. Layla glanced at her son and then back at Julian, her lips pressed together, the corners of her mouth tightening as if she were carefully choosing her words. "That's your father, Elias," she said quietly. Elias looked up at her with wide eyes. "My daddy," Julian's heart skipped a beat. The word daddy coming from Elias's lips was like a punch to the gut. He was his father. This child, this boy who was standing before him, with eyes full of trust and innocence, was his. And yet Julian felt like a stranger in his own son's life. "Yes," Layla said softly, her voice steady. "Your daddy." She placed a hand on Elias's shoulder and turned him toward Julian. "Go say hello to him, Elias." The boy took a few hesitant steps forward, his gaze flicking from Layla to Julian. His voice was shy, but there was a quiet confidence in his small frame as he reached out a hand. "Hi, Daddy," Elias said simply, his voice soft, but filled with an earnestness that knocked the breath out of Julian. "I'm Elias." Julian stood frozen, his hand hovering in midair, unsure of what to do, how to react. The boy's innocence, his warmth, the trust in those bright green eyes. It was overwhelming. "Hi, Elias." Julian finally managed, his voice hoarse. "It's nice to meet you." The weight of the moment crashed down on him, and Julian realized, with stark clarity, that this was just the beginning of a journey he had never planned for, but had to face head-on. The past had come crashing into his present, and there was no turning back now. The noise of the ballroom faded as Julian moved away from Layla and Elias, his mind buzzing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them coherent. He needed space, needed to process, but the more he tried to escape the gravity of the moment, the more the reality of his son, Elias, crept in, haunting him with every step. His future, his perfect wedding. Everything seemed to be shattering in slow motion. He excused himself to the nearest terrace, the cool night air washing over him, but it did little to calm his racing pulse. His fingers dug into the cold stone railing as he leaned over, staring out into the sprawling gardens beneath the castle. He tried to focus, to think clearly. He had been a fool, yes, but how had it all gone so wrong? A quiet footstep broke the silence behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The tension in his body told him everything he needed to know. Aurora had followed him, her heels clicking softly against the cobblestones. There was no escaping this conversation. "You disappeared." Aurora's voice cut through the silence, sharp and controlled, yet tinged with hurt. "I was waiting for you inside, Julian. You just walked away." Julian's throat tightened. He turned slowly, facing her for the first time since the uncomfortable scene in the ballroom. Her eyes were wide, searching, desperate to make sense of what had happened. "Aurora, No," she interrupted, her voice steady but cold. "You don't get to say anything right now. Not after what I just saw. You didn't even tell me about him. About your son." The words stung more than he cared to admit. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration and confusion mingling with guilt. "I didn't know," he said quietly, his voice trembling despite his attempt to sound confident. "I didn't know about Elias. I had no idea he existed, Aurora. Aurora's laugh was short and sharp, a brittle sound that caught him off guard. "Are you serious? You didn't know? You didn't see her again, after everything? After that night?" Her eyes narrowed, and she took a step closer to him, her tone growing more incredulous. "She tried to tell you. She tried. But you didn't care, did you?" The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and Julian felt a deep pang of regret twist in his gut. "Aurora, He started again, but she shook her head, stepping back as if to put distance between them. "No, don't say anything else. You never told me you had a past like that. You never said anything about Leela or how you just walked away from her. And now, on the night we're supposed to start our future, you've just, what? Reconnected with her. With him." Her voice cracked on the last word. She was hurt. So hurt, and he had no idea how to fix it. Julian's chest tightened. He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? That he had never meant for any of this to happen. That he hadn't even known about Elias until a few hours ago. How could he explain the overwhelming confusion? The realization that his son, this child who looked so much like him, had been living a life without him for 5 years. And how could he explain to Aurora that in the face of this revelation, everything he thought he knew about his life had crumbled to dust? "Aurora, please," he said, finally finding his voice. "This wasn't part of the plan. You have to understand. I never understand." She interrupted, her voice rising now. "How am I supposed to understand this, Julian? You've built this empire. You've spent your life chasing success. And now you want me to believe that you didn't even notice the real consequences. That you didn't see what abandoning Leela meant. That you didn't know you had a child." Her eyes were blazing now, her disappointment palpable. Julian's throat burned with the weight of her words. He had no defense, no excuse, nothing that could undo what he had done. The man he had become, this carefully crafted version of himself, seemed so distant now, like a stranger he didn't even recognize. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He couldn't look at her now. He had done something unforgivable, and he knew it. Aurora stood still for a long moment, her face unreadable, her fists clenched at her sides. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke again, her voice much quieter, but no less cutting. "I think I need to go," she said softly. Her words hit him like a cold wind. I can't do this, Julian. Not tonight. Not after everything." She turned on her heel, her gown swishing around her as she walked toward the door, not looking back even once. "Aurora, wait." Julian reached out, but she didn't slow down. She was already gone, leaving him alone on the terrace, the weight of her departure settling over him like a dark cloud. Julian stood there for a long while, the night air biting at his skin, his mind reeling. He had just lost everything. His wedding, his fiancé, his future, all for a mistake he couldn't undo. And in the distance, he could still see Layla standing by the entrance, Ilias beside her, the unspoken promise in her eyes. "I've built a life without you, Julian. You had your chance." Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The guests who had once moved in elegant clusters now whispered in hushed tones, their eyes flicking toward the terrace, toward the scene unfolding there. Leela, however, had remained quiet, observing it all from the sidelines, her arms crossed lightly as she watched Julian stand motionless, his posture rigid and heavy with regret. But it wasn't pity she felt for him. No, Leela had long stopped pitying Julian. It was something different now. Something that had taken root when she'd first seen him. The man who had walked out of her life without even knowing about his own son. She had once loved him, once believed in his promises. But life had moved on. She had moved on. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal that hung between them. How could he have been so blind? So self-absorbed? She took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pushing against her chest. It was time for the confrontation. The one she had kept at bay for years, the one that she had hoped would never come. She turned and walked toward him. Julian was still standing on the terrace when Leela approached, her footsteps quiet but certain. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. There was no trace of the anger or hurt he had expected. Just a calm, almost detached resolve. "You didn't tell me," she said, her voice low but steady. "You didn't tell me about Elias, Julian. And you didn't even care enough to notice." Julian's breath caught in his throat. The weight of her words crashed over him, and for the first time in years, he was faced with the stark truth of his actions. No more justifications, no more excuses. "I know," he said hoarsely, stepping toward her. "I was wrong. I was so wrong." Lila didn't flinch. She didn't even look away. Instead, she met him head-on. "It's too late for apologies now, Julian. You don't get to just show up and fix everything with a few words. You left me. You left us. And you can't just walk back into our lives like nothing happened." "I didn't mean to," Julian said desperately, his voice thick with regret. "I never meant to hurt you. I never meant to leave you alone. Lila's eyes softened for a moment, but then the wall she had built around herself returned. She straightened, folding her arms over her chest. I built a life for Elias. A good one. A real one. And I won't let you tear that down with your guilt and your promises. I'm not asking to tear anything down, Julian said, his voice pleading. I'm asking for a chance to be a father. Lila's gaze was unwavering, but for a moment, Julian thought he saw something shift in her eyes, a flicker of hope, however small. But it was gone almost immediately, replaced by the same guarded determination. Maybe, she said, her voice low. But that's not for you to decide. It's for Elias, and he's not just some pawn in your life. Julian's heart hammered in his chest. He understood now, in a way he hadn't before. This wasn't just about him. This was about them, Elias and Lila. And Julian wasn't sure where he fit into that picture anymore. But he would fight. He would fight for a chance to make things right, even if he didn't know how. The castle's towering walls loomed over the guests like a silent witness to the unraveling of Julian Thompson's carefully constructed world. In the grand ballroom, the glittering chandeliers still hung like symbols of his wealth and ambition, casting their lavish glow over the remnants of what was meant to be his most triumphant day. But the atmosphere had shifted. The buzz of excitement had died down, replaced by whispered conversations and sidelong glances. No one was talking about the wedding anymore. They were talking about the scandal, the sudden disappearance of the bride, the appearance of the mysterious child, and the shocking revelation of Julian's son. Julian stood by the large windows overlooking the garden, his hands pressed against the cool glass. Outside, the crisp autumn air had settled into a deep chill, but inside, the warmth of the castle only seemed to accentuate the coldness that had crept into his life. He was no longer the center of attention, no longer the man with the perfect life. His fortune, his success, even the woman who had stood beside him moments ago, all of it felt irrelevant now. His wedding had been canceled, not because of the lavish cost or the complex arrangements, not because of any logistical nightmare, but because of a child, his child, Elias. Julian had never imagined that something as simple as parenthood could upend everything he thought he knew about himself. Yet here he was, standing at the crossroads of his past and future, unsure of where to turn next. Aurora's absence felt like a void. She had left earlier in a swirl of emotion, her heart shattered by his sudden, inexplicable shift in priorities. Julian knew it wasn't just about Elias. It wasn't even about him canceling the wedding. It was the entire image he had built up. An image of control, success, and a life that revolved around his ambition. That life was gone now, destroyed not by anyone but himself. Aurora's departure had been swift, cold, and final. She had left him with nothing but the quiet hum of an empty ballroom and the bitter taste of failure in his mouth. He couldn't even blame her. He had built his empire on ambition, on wealth, on status, and when the opportunity to show off that empire had come, he had never once stopped to think about what it might cost. Not until he saw Elias. Not until it hit him like a truck. The love he thought he could buy with his fortune had always been hollow. But fatherhood, that was real. It was something raw and untouchable, something that demanded more than money or social status. And now he had to reckon with the consequences. Lila had stayed mostly in the background of the evening, her presence like a ghost haunting Julian's every step. She hadn't come to confront him. She wasn't there to make him feel guilty. At least, that was how it seemed. Instead, she'd chosen to keep her distance, observing, watching, and perhaps, for the first time, letting him feel the weight of his own choices. She had made it clear in their conversation earlier that she wasn't willing to let Julian waltz back into their lives just because he suddenly realized the truth. She wasn't willing to let him undo the years she had spent building a life without him. And that, Julian realized, was the hardest pill to swallow. The life she had created for Elias had been enough. It was enough for her. And now he had to prove that he could be enough too. The soft sound of footsteps behind him broke his reverie. He didn't have to turn to know who it was. "Leila," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "Julian," she replied, her tone even but laden with an undercurrent of something unreadable. She stepped closer, the sound of her heels muted on the marble floor. She didn't look at him right away. Instead, she gazed out at the landscape, the sprawling grounds lit by the dim glow of lanterns in the distance. "I didn't want it to end like this," he said, his eyes tracing the outline of her silhouette, trying to read her through the shadows. "I didn't want any of this, but I can't pretend anymore. I can't go back to the way things were." Leila didn't respond right away. Her lips pressed together, her jaw tightening. When she spoke, her voice was measured, calm. "I'm not asking you to," she said quietly. "I'm asking you to understand that what you want doesn't matter right now. It's not about you, Julian. It's about Elias. It always has been." He turned fully toward her then, his chest tight with the weight of his words. "I understand that. I do. But I also understand that I've been wrong about everything. I've been wrong about my career, about Aurora, about the things that matter. And most of all, I've been wrong about you. I wasn't there for you when you needed me. And now, I don't know how to make that right, but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to do whatever it takes, Leila." Leila's gaze was distant, her eyes hard and unreadable. She stepped back slightly, placing distance between them. "I'm not asking for anything from you, Julian," she said, her voice softening, but there was a finality to it that he couldn't ignore. "I'm not asking for apologies. I'm not asking for gestures of guilt. I'm asking for the truth." "The truth," Julian repeated, confused. He reached out a hand, but she took another step back, shaking her head. "You think you can fix this with money," Leila said, her voice steady, but with an edge of something Julian hadn't heard before. A quiet strength, a resolve that was hard and uncompromising. "You think that because you have everything that I could want or need, you can just come back into our lives and make it all okay. But you can't. I built a life for Elias without you. I don't need your wealth, and I don't need you to buy my forgiveness." "I'm not trying to buy your forgiveness," Julian said, his voice tight with frustration. "I'm trying to be a father. That's all. I don't care about the wedding. I don't care about anything but Elias. I can't change the past, but I can be here now. I can show him that I'm here for him, that I'm not just someone who walks away." Leila's face softened for a moment, but then her eyes hardened again, her gaze turning away from him. "You can't just show up and expect everything to fall into place, Julian. You're right that you can't change the past. But there's a lot of damage you've done. You can't erase that." The weight of her words settled heavily in the pit of his stomach. He had thought that if he just acted like a father, if he just made the right gestures, it would all fall into place. But it wasn't that simple. Leila was right. It was never that simple. Suddenly, the doors behind them creaked open again, and Julian turned to see his parents, Josephine and Robert, entering the terrace. His mother's eyes were wide with concern, her features soft with that ever-present maternal instinct that Julian had ignored for so long. His father, Robert, was quieter, more reserved, but the subtle shake of his head told Julian all he needed to know. They had heard the news. They had seen the consequences of his actions. "Julian," his mother said, her voice gentle but firm, "I think it's time we all went home. There's nothing left here for us tonight." His father gave a short nod, his lips pressed into a thin line. "You made your choices, son. Now you have to live with them." Julian didn't argue. He knew they were right. There was nothing left to salvage in this castle, nothing left of the perfect life he had tried to create. He turned back to Leila, his heart heavy with the truth. The woman who had once been his everything was now a stranger, and the child who had been born of his neglect was someone he had to earn the right to know. "I'll be here," Julian said quietly, the words coming from a place of raw honesty. "I'll be here for both of you. I don't know how, but I'll find a way." Leila looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Before she nodded, a faint glimmer of something passing between them. An understanding, perhaps, or an unspoken agreement. It was enough for now. But the truth was clear. The era of Julian Thompson as the self-made king of his empire was over. Now he had to rebuild his life on something more fragile, more human. And that was the hardest thing of all. The following weeks passed in a blur of quiet reckoning for Julian Thompson. The grandeur of his empire, the opulent hotels and luxury cars, the constant meetings and investment calls, all of it felt like a distant dream now. His world had shifted irrevocably. He could still feel the pulse of his career, but it no longer had the same magnetic pull. The call to ambition that had once driven him relentlessly was now dulled by something deeper, something he had never allowed himself to fully embrace until now. Elias. Every time Julian said his son's name, it felt like a new truth was settling in his bones, making him question everything he thought he knew about success and happiness. But the path to rebuilding this relationship with Elias wasn't going to be easy. Lila's wariness was like an impenetrable wall, and Julian knew better than to think he could simply bulldoze his way through it. It wasn't about showing up with grand gestures or fancy gifts. It was about something more fundamental: presence. He had to prove to Lila, to Elias, and most importantly, to himself, that he was capable of being a father. Not an absentee one, but a real, consistent one. The first meeting between Julian and Elias after the wedding fiasco had been brief and tentative. Layla had insisted on keeping things low-key, suggesting they meet at a local park near her apartment. No fanfare, no cameras, just the three of them, in the quiet of the afternoon, trying to navigate this new reality. Julian stood at the edge of the park, his heart in his throat, as he watched Lila and Elias from a distance. Lila was sitting on a bench, chatting with Elias, her smile soft and genuine. The little boy was on the swings, his laughter ringing through the air as his feet kicked higher with each motion. There was a joy in his expression that made Julian's chest tighten. Elias looked so much like him. The same dark hair, the same piercing green eyes, the same way he tilted his head when he smiled. "My son," Julian thought again, the words still foreign but strangely comforting. "Do you need a minute?" the voice said beside him, pulling him from his thoughts. Julian turned to see his mother, Josephine, standing beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. Her eyes were warm but thoughtful, as though she understood the weight of the moment better than anyone. "I'm fine," Julian replied, though the tightness in his throat betrayed him. "I just don't know how to do this, Mom." Josephine gave him a knowing look. "There's no script, Julian. No perfect way to start. Just take it one step at a time." He nodded slowly, appreciating her words but still feeling the enormity of the situation. His entire life had been a series of calculated steps, strategies and plans, goals set and achieved. But this was something else entirely. "I'll go over there," Julian said, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't know what to say, but I have to start somewhere." Josephine smiled at him, her eyes soft with pride and love. "Just be yourself, Julian. That's all Elias needs right now. The rest will follow." Julian took a deep breath and walked slowly toward the bench. As he neared, Elias's head snapped toward him, his face lighting up in an expression of pure curiosity. "Hi," Julian said softly, kneeling down to Elias's level. His voice cracked slightly, but he cleared his throat and tried again. "Hi, Elias. I'm Julian." Elias didn't say anything immediately. Instead, he looked at Julian with wide, serious eyes, like he was trying to figure out if this man, this stranger, was someone he should trust. Layla watched from the bench, her arms crossed, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't going to make this easy, Julian knew. She was giving him the space he needed, but she wasn't going to let him off the hook either. After a long moment, Elias spoke in a quiet, innocent voice. "Are you my daddy?" The words hit Julian like a physical blow. It was so simple, so straightforward, yet so loaded. Elias's eyes were wide with curiosity, but there was no expectation. He wasn't asking for anything extravagant. He just wanted the truth. Julian swallowed hard, his heart racing. "Yes, Elias," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am." There was a long silence, and for a moment, Julian thought he had made a mistake. But then Elias smiled, a tentative, uncertain smile that tugged at Julian's heart in a way he hadn't expected. "Okay," Elias said simply, before turning back to the swings. He kicked his legs, sending himself into a higher arc. "I like swings," he added nonchalantly, as though it was the most normal thing in the world. Lila's eyes softened as she watched her son. She didn't look at Julian, but her posture relaxed, just a little. For Julian, the silence that followed felt both heavy and fragile, like the quiet before a storm. He wanted to speak, to tell Elias everything he felt, but he knew better than to rush. It wasn't enough to just say he was there. He had to show it. Later that evening, after they had spent a few hours at the park, Leila and Elias walking ahead, Julian lingering behind with his thoughts, Leila turned to him as they approached her car. "I'm not going to make this easy, Julian," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You've got a lot of work to do. You don't just get to swoop in and fix things. Elias has been without you for 5 years. You can't undo that." "I don't expect to," Julian replied, his voice low but resolute. He paused, glancing at Elias, who was hopping around on the sidewalk, lost in his own world. "I'm not here to undo the past, Lila. I'm here to build something for the future. With him. With you." Lila's eyes softened, but the wariness remained. "And what makes you think you can do that, Julian?" Julian took a deep breath, the weight of her question settling over him. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in what felt like years. The woman who had once been his everything, the woman who had stood by him until he chose ambition over her. "I've been wrong," he said quietly, "for a long time. And I've spent so much of my life thinking that success was about power, about wealth. But now I see that it's about love, and time, and trust. I can't promise that I'll be perfect, Lila, but I can promise that I'll be here, every day. I'll be here for both of you." Lila's eyes searched his face, the lines of suspicion still drawn in the corners of her eyes. But Julian could see the faintest flicker of something in her expression, something like hope, or perhaps relief. "I'll hold you to that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And with that, she turned away, her hand reaching out to gently grasp Elias's small one as they walked to the car. As they drove away, Julian stood in place, watching the taillights disappear down the street. A new chapter was beginning. He didn't know what it would look like, or where it would lead, but one thing was certain. He was no longer the same man who had walked into that castle weeks ago. He had a long road ahead of him, one filled with challenges and hard truths. But for the first time in his life, he was ready to face them, not as the self-made millionaire, not as the ambitious mogul, but as a father who had made a promise. The days after Julian's first tentative steps toward fatherhood were both strangely familiar and unfamiliar at once. His life, once dominated by boardrooms, cocktail parties, and international business meetings, had slowed down to a pace he wasn't used to. He now found himself watching cartoons with Elias, grocery shopping with Leila, and navigating the delicate art of fatherhood, something he had long ago resigned himself to not understanding. But it wasn't just about learning how to be a father. It was about learning how to be a part of their world, not as a figurehead or an outsider, but as a true, present force in their lives. And that was harder than any business deal he'd ever made. The mornings were the hardest. Julian was used to waking up to the hum of emails, the rush of phone calls, and the ever-present pressure of his wealth. But now his mornings began with the sound of Elias's laughter, or the crinkle of cereal boxes, or the dull thud of little feet running across the wooden floors of Lila's apartment. Lila's apartment was a far cry from the gleaming penthouse Julian had left behind. The space was cozy, welcoming, but modest, a stark contrast to the grandiose spaces he had spent most of his life in. Still, it had a warmth that the cold glass towers of his offices had never held. It felt like a home, not just a place where people lived. On the mornings when Julian arrived, usually after having stayed at a nearby hotel to give them space, Elias would rush to the door, grinning from ear to ear. His hair was always a mess from sleep, and his pajamas, covered in small cartoon animals, clung to his small body as he bounded toward Julian. "Daddy," Elias would shout, holding up his arms, demanding to be lifted. It was these moments that filled Julian with a tenderness he hadn't known he could feel. He would scoop Elias into his arms, the weight of the small body in his embrace feeling like a revelation. "Good morning, champ," Julian would say, ruffling Elias's hair. "What are we doing today?" Elias would usually answer with something simple, like, "We're going to the park," or "I want pancakes." But his enthusiasm was contagious, and slowly, Julian started looking forward to these mornings. Lila, on the other hand, remained a mystery to him in many ways. She wasn't distant, but there was a reserve in her interactions with him, a wariness that hadn't fully dissipated. She was a mother first, and that would always come before anything else, Julian realized. And though she had allowed him to be a part of Elias's life, she had not yet opened the door for him to be a part of hers. One evening, after a quiet dinner with Elias at the small kitchen table, Lila cleared the dishes and turned to Julian as she wiped her hands on a dish towel. "Do you mind if we talk?" she asked, her tone casual, but there was an edge to it that Julian couldn't ignore. He met her gaze, instantly sensing the weight of the conversation. "Of course," he said, pushing his chair back and standing. "What's on your mind?" Lila hesitated, then sat down across from him, folding her hands in front of her. "I know you're trying, Julian," she began, "but I need to know something. Anything." Her voice dropped slightly, a thread of caution creeping into her words. "How much of this is about Elias, and how much of it is about you, about your image?" The question stung. It wasn't unfair, and it wasn't unexpected, but it still stung. "I thought I was clear about this," Julian said, his tone quieter than usual. "This isn't about my image. I didn't know about Elias. I never knew. And when I did know, I had to face the fact that I spent so many years focused on the wrong things." He looked down for a moment, finding it hard to meet her eyes. "I don't want to mess this up. I don't want to lose him again." Lila's gaze softened, but she didn't look away. "I'm not saying you're doing this for the wrong reasons, Julian. But I need to know you're not going to bail the minute it gets hard. I've had to raise Elias alone, and I've done it. I don't need a man who's going to show up when it's convenient. I need someone who's here, day in and day out." Julian nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him. He understood now. This was her protection, her way of keeping Elias safe from heartbreak. And as much as he resented the implication, he couldn't blame her. After all, he had left her once before. "I'm not going anywhere, Lila," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "I won't ever leave him again. Or you. Not if you'll let me be a part of your lives." There was a long silence as Lila studied him, her eyes sharp and calculating. Finally, she nodded, though there was still a hesitation in her expression. "All right," she said softly. "But remember, actions speak louder than words. If you're serious about being here, you'll have to show it. And that means patience. With me, with Elias, with everything." "I can do patience," Julian replied quietly, his voice steady. "It's not something I've been good at, but I'll learn. For him. For both of you." The next few weeks unfolded with a strange rhythm, one that Julian could only describe as the new normal. He wasn't exactly a fixture in their home. Layla was still very much in control of the pace and direction of their life, but he was trying. He was showing up, day after day, and he was there for Elias in ways he hadn't been for the first 5 years of the boy's life. They started doing little things together, visiting the same park each Saturday as Elias requested. Julian had never given much thought to parks before. He had always been more concerned with where the next investment would take him. But now he found himself on the swings, laughing as Elias tried to beat him in races, his feet kicking up dirt from the sandpit. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't grand, but it was real. One Saturday afternoon, after an impromptu picnic in the park, Elias pulled Julian to the side, his little hand tugging at Julian's sleeve. "Daddy, look," he said excitedly, pointing to a cluster of trees. "I can climb these. Watch." Before Julian could respond, Elias was already scrambling up the thick trunk of a nearby oak, his small body agile and quick. "Elias, wait." Julian started to warn, but Elias was already at the top, looking down at him with a grin. "I can do it, Daddy. I can do it." Julian stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether to call him down or let him continue. But then something inside him clicked. He didn't need to control everything. Elias was growing, becoming more confident. Julian could allow him to take risks, within reason. After all, wasn't that what fatherhood was about? Letting go just enough so they could figure things out for themselves. "All right, buddy, but be careful," Julian said, his voice steady but with a hint of admiration. Elias beamed at him, proud of his achievement. "Look, Daddy, I'm like a superhero." The pure joy on Elias's face made Julian's heart swell. This, he realized, was what he had been missing. These small moments, these fleeting expressions of triumph and innocence, were the things that truly mattered. The next morning, as Julian sat across from Leila at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, the silence between them was comfortable, no longer filled with the sharp edges of unresolved tension. "I'm starting to see it," Julian said, his voice thoughtful as he looked down at his cup. "What you mean, I mean. About patience, about being here." Leila glanced at him, her expression softer than it had been weeks ago. "Good," she said simply, her tone laced with quiet approval. "It's a long road, Julian, but you're on the right track." "I won't let you down," he said, his voice earnest, his heart heavy with the weight of his promise. "I'll be here, every day, for both of you." Leila met his gaze then, her eyes clear and unguarded for just a moment. "I hope so," she said quietly, and for the first time in a long while, Julian truly believed it. The days had begun to feel like a new kind of rhythm, one that Julian Thompson was still learning to follow. But after months of trying to prove himself to Leila, to Elias, and perhaps most importantly, to himself, Julian found that the future was not as distant or as unreachable as he once believed. It had always been there, in the small, quiet moments, like a slow sunrise creeping over the horizon, steady and unwavering, if only he would take the time to notice it. It was a cool fall morning when Julian arrived at Lila's apartment with a small but thoughtful gift in hand, an old wooden puzzle box he'd picked up from a nearby antique shop. Elias had mentioned, almost in passing, that he liked puzzles, so Julian figured it was a simple enough gesture, a way to show that he was paying attention. Leila opened the door with a surprised smile, a rare sight these days, as she had grown accustomed to Julian's presence, but still maintained her cautious distance. She had become, in many ways, his anchor, the one who kept him grounded. And Julian had come to realize that there was no greater luxury than that. "Good morning," Julian greeted, holding up the box, his smile genuine. "Got something for the little man." Leila raised an eyebrow, but accepted the box with a nod. "You didn't have to." "I know," Julian interrupted, his smile widening. "But I thought it might be something he'd enjoy." Before Leila could say more, Elias came bounding down the hall, his shoes scuffing along the hardwood floor as he approached them. He stopped just in front of Julian, his small hands reaching for the box, his eyes wide with excitement. "A puzzle," Elias exclaimed, his face lighting up. "Thanks, Daddy." Julian felt a swell of warmth as Elias took the box from his hands and ran back to the living room. It was a small thing, but Elias's joy felt monumental. It made everything Julian had worked for. The sleepless nights, the uncomfortable silences, the slow rebuild, feel worth it. Lila watched the interaction quietly, arms folded. There was a softness in her gaze as she observed the little boy, her son, as he tried to figure out the puzzle box with his tiny fingers. "Where did you find this?" Lila asked, her tone neutral but touched with curiosity. "Just a little shop nearby," Julian replied, his voice lighter now. "I thought he'd like it. He's been talking about puzzles for weeks." Lila didn't respond immediately, but she gave him a look, half appreciative, half skeptical. "I've noticed," she said, "you've really been paying attention." Julian felt a tug at his heart. There was no sarcasm in her voice, no walls of distrust, just a quiet acknowledgement. It was the first time in a long while that he felt like he might actually be earning her trust, bit by bit. "Do you think I could be a good father, Lila?" Julian asked, his voice quiet, unsure if the question was more for himself than for her. Lila tilted her head, her eyes softening as she studied him. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't know what the future holds. But you've been here, and that matters more than anything." Julian looked down, his chest heavy with emotion. "I don't want to mess this up," he said softly. "I don't want to be the kind of father who shows up and disappears when things get hard. I've made enough mistakes, Lila." She was quiet for a long time, the only sound in the room the soft murmurs of Elias in the other room, struggling with the puzzle. Finally, Lila spoke. "I don't think you'll mess it up," she said, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "Not if you keep trying, and not if you keep showing up." The next few weeks felt like a slow unfolding of a story that was still being written. Julian had settled into a routine with Elias and Lila, and though the lines between his past life and his present one were still blurry at times, there was a growing sense of peace in the day-to-day existence they were building together. Julian found himself spending more and more time in the small, quiet corners of Lila's life, where the hustle and chaos of his former world no longer held sway. He'd go with Lila to the local farmers market on Sundays, where they'd pick out fresh vegetables and homemade jams. He'd help Elias with his school projects, teaching him how to use a glue stick and encouraging him with every new step. But it was in the evenings, when the three of them sat down for dinner, that Julian felt the most at home. They would talk about their day, Elias's new friends at school, Layla's latest gardening project, and Julian's less glamorous but more meaningful work at the tech startup he'd recently become involved with. For the first time in years, Julian realized that he didn't need to be the one with the grand story or the high-powered job. He didn't need to be the center of attention. He just needed to be there. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes, Julian felt like a stranger in his own life, unsure of where he fit into the puzzle of this small, steady existence. He had to fight against the reflex to control, to organize, to dominate. He had to unlearn the habits of a lifetime and give himself permission to fail, to be imperfect, to not have all the answers. And yet, every day, something inside him shifted. Elias's laughter, the warmth of Lila's smile, the peace in the ordinary moments. They were slowly rebuilding the man Julian had lost sight of. The one who wasn't consumed by ambition, the one who didn't need validation from the world. One evening, as they sat on the couch together, Elias snuggled up between them with a book in his hands, ready for their nightly ritual of reading before bed. Julian looked over at Lila. "Do you ever think about what the future will look like?" he asked softly, his gaze drifting toward the window, where the last light of the day was fading into night. Lila met his gaze and smiled, though it was small and thoughtful. "I used to think about it all the time," she said. "I thought I had it all figured out, you know. But now," she glanced at Elias, whose eyes were wide as he flipped through the pages of the book. "Now I'm not so sure. I just know I want us to be happy, to be okay." You think we'll get there? Julian asked, his voice tentative but hopeful. Lila's smile deepened, though there was still a trace of caution in her eyes. I think we're already there, she said quietly. One step at a time. Elias looked up from his book, his face lighting up with excitement. Can we read another one, Mommy? I'm not sleepy yet, he exclaimed. Julian chuckled, the sound rich and genuine, and Lila rolled her eyes affectionately. All right, she said, reaching for another book. One more story. And as she read aloud, her voice weaving through the room like a soft melody, Julian realized that this small, imperfect, and yet deeply fulfilling life was the one he had always been searching for. He didn't need the mansion, the luxury, or the endless accolades. What he needed, what he had found, was this: the love of a woman who had always known what mattered, the trust of a son who was learning to call him Dad, and the slow, steady creation of a future built on presence, patience, and mutual care. Julian leaned back into the couch, his arm resting lightly on the back of it. Elias's laughter echoed through the room as he leaned in close to Lila, his voice full of innocence and wonder. For the first time in a long while, Julian felt a profound sense of peace, a peace that wasn't dependent on his bank account or his reputation. It was a peace that came from the simple, quiet love of family, a future reborn.